Put the phone down, Chloe. Put it down right now, or I swear to God I will make sure your father never sees a single breath you take inside this house again." That was the last thing I heard through the receiver before the line went dead, followed by a sound like a heavy wooden chair splintering against drywall. My phone screen was still flashing crimson with the emergency alert. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday, and the rain was turning to sleet on the windshield of my old Ford truck. I didn't care about the speed limits. I didn't care about the black ice on the state highway. I pushed that engine until the cabin vibrated. My knuckles locked onto the cracked vinyl steering wheel so hard my wrists turned white. When I finally threw the truck into park on the front lawn of the house on Elm Street, 2 police cruisers were already there, their blue and red lights bouncing off the wet oak trees and the neat white siding. The front door didn't just open, it exploded inward as the lead officer drove his boot into the lock. I was 3 steps behind them, the smell of gunpowder and old, damp basement air hitting my face as we crossed the threshold. Chloe was on the floor. Her left shoulder was twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn over, her fingers clutching a broken glass mug, and her face swollen where a heavy hand had found its mark. Julian was standing over her, his chest heaving, his expensive Italian leather shoes covered in drywall dust. His eyes were wide, but they weren't wild with rage. They were cold, calculating, already looking for the exit. "Get away from her," I roared. The officers lunged, tackling him into the coffee table, sending a stack of legal documents and bills flying across the hardwood floor. I was on my knees beside my daughter before the wood stopped splintering. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a dry, ragged scrape against her throat. I pressed the button. I did it. "I know, sweetheart," I said, my voice breaking as I wrapped my hands around hers, avoiding the purple marks already rising on her wrists. "Dad is here. I've got you. My name is Robert Vance. I am 60 years old, and for 32 years I worked as a structural inspector and heavy machinery technician for the city of Boston. I know how things are built. I know where the stress fractures hide, and I know exactly how much pressure a support beam can take before the entire roof comes crashing down. But for 3 years, I let myself ignore the tiny cracks forming in my own daughter's life, because it was easier to believe the beautiful lie she was trying so hard to tell me. My wife, Martha, passed away 4 years ago from an aggressive form of lymphoma that took her in less than 6 months. On her last night in the sterile room at Massachusetts General Hospital, she held my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a woman who weighed less than 90 pounds. "Take care of our girl, Robert," she whispered, the rattle in her chest rising with every breath. "She's just like me. She'll try to carry the whole world on her shoulders before she asks for help. Don't let her carry it alone." I promised her I wouldn't. I kissed her cold forehead, and 3 hours later, she was gone. I retired the following winter, unable to stand the quiet of our empty house in New Hampshire, and moved into a smaller place closer to the city just to be near Chloe. Chloe was 29 years old, a kindergarten teacher who spent her weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter and her evenings grading papers with a patience that always reminded me of her mother. She had the same dark, expressive eyes that could tell you exactly what she was thinking without her ever opening her mouth. Until she married Julian Sterling in the summer of 2022. Julian was a landscape architect and high-end residential contractor. He was a broad-shouldered, charismatic man with a smile that could sell snow to an Eskimo. He called me sir for the first 6 months, bought me expensive whiskey I didn't want, and talked endlessly about the luxury projects he was landing in the wealthier suburbs. He seemed like a man on his way up, but I had spent 30 years inspecting foundations, and I knew that the polished stone on the outside of a house didn't mean a damn thing if the concrete underneath was crumbling. The requests started small, always under the guise of temporary cash flow issues. $1,000 for an equipment repair in the spring of 2023. $3,000 for a supplier deposit that was delayed. Every time Chloe would call me, her voice tight and high-pitched, apologizing for even asking, telling me Julian was just about to close a major deal that would clear everything up. I kept a small black leather ledger in my desk drawer. I wrote down every single loan, the date, the amount, and the vague promise of repayment. By the autumn of 2025, the total stood at $28,400. Not a single cent had ever been returned. Then came the Sunday dinner that broke everything. It was the first week of October. The leaves had turned a deep, bloody red along the highway, and the air was crisp enough to freeze your breath. Chloe had invited me to their home on Elm Street for a pot roast dinner. When I arrived, the atmosphere inside the house was as thick as wet cement. Julian's stepmother, Eleanor, was there, sitting on the plush sofa in her designer knit sweater, her gold bracelets clinking like tiny chains every time she moved her wrist. Beside her was Julian's younger brother, Marcus, a 25-year-old who had never held a job for more than 3 months, but drove a brand new sports car that Julian had supposedly co-signed for. Chloe was in the kitchen, her movements hurried, almost frantic. She dropped a metal spoon on the linoleum, and the clatter made her jump so violently she nearly knocked over the water pitcher. "Are you all right, Chloe?" I asked, stepping into the kitchen to help her pick it up. "I'm fine, Dad, just tired. School has been really hectic this week," she said, her smile bright, automatic, and completely empty of any real warmth. We sat down at the table. The conversation was dominated by Julian and Eleanor, talking about a new development project in Brookline. Julian was eating with a slow, deliberate focus, but his eyes kept darting toward the folder sitting on the sideboard. It was a thick, black-bound corporate portfolio. When the plates were cleared, Julian didn't wait for Chloe to sit down before he reached for the folder. He placed it on the center of the dining table with a heavy, echoing thud. "Robert, we need to talk business," Julian said, his tone shifting into that smooth, polished sales pitch I had grown to despise. "The Brookline project is a massive opportunity, but the initial bonding requirements are steeper than we anticipated. The bank is offering a bridge loan of $85,000, but because of some recent restructuring in my firm, they need a strong guarantor, someone with solid, paid-off assets." He slid the folder across the table toward me. "I want you to co-sign the line of credit, Robert. It's an 18% interest rate, but that's just a placeholder until the project draws down in 90 days. You won't have to pay a single dollar. It's just a formality to appease the underwriters." I didn't open the folder. I kept my hands on my coffee mug, feeling the warmth of the ceramic against my palms, and looked him straight in the eyes. 18% isn't a formality, Julian," I said, my voice low and steady. "That's a high-risk penalty rate. If the bank trusted your cash flow, they wouldn't be asking for a retired civil servant's mortgage-free home as collateral." Eleanor made a sharp, clicking sound with her tongue. "Really, Robert," she said, leaning forward, her face tight with artificial concern. "This is about your daughter's future. If Julian's business succeeds, Chloe succeeds. Family is supposed to stand together when these opportunities arise. Don't be difficult." I opened the folder then. I didn't rush. I spent 15 minutes reading every single line of the loan agreement, while the room grew increasingly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, anxious tapping of Chloe's foot under the table and the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. The document was a financial death trap. Page 9 contained a cross-collateralization clause that linked the loan directly to my primary residence in New Hampshire. Page 14 allowed the lender to seize my personal assets immediately upon a single missed payment, without pursuing Julian's business accounts first. It was designed to protect the bank by completely liquidating me the moment something went wrong. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "I won't sign this," I said. Julian's face didn't crumble. It hardened. The smooth, charming mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing a cold, vicious arrogance underneath. "You're going to let your daughter's home go under because of a piece of paper?" he asked, his voice dropping into a register that was quiet, intense, and dripping with venom. "The man who's going to make her lose her home isn't me, Julian," I replied, standing up from the table. Chloe flinched at the sound of my chair scraping against the wood. It wasn't a normal startle. It was the full-body shudder of someone who had learned to expect a blow after a sudden noise. My heart rate spiked, a sickening realization blooming in the back of my mind. "We're leaving," Eleanor said, grabbing her designer purse and standing up. "Robert, you are a selfish, bitter old man." Julian picked up the folder, his knuckles white, and walked toward the front hall without another word. Chloe followed him, her head down, her shoulders hunched. I heard them in the entryway, the low, furious hiss of his voice, the soft, pleading tone of hers. Then, the front door slammed hard enough to rattle the framed family photos on the hallway wall. I stood in the dining room alone. The pot roast was cold, the candles were flickering down to their wicks, and the silence in the house felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. On the floor near Chloe's chair, something caught the light. I leaned down and picked it up. It was a small white pearl button from her favorite cardigan. The threads were torn, pulled violently from the fabric. I squeezed that button in my fist until the edges dug into my palm. I walked out to my truck. The October wind was howling through the bare branches of the maples, throwing dry leaves against my windshield. Julian's truck was still idling in the driveway, exhaust pluming white in the cold air. I walked up to the passenger side and tapped on the glass. Chloe rolled the window down slowly. Her face was turned away from me, her hair pulled forward to cover the side of her neck. "Chloe, look at me," I said. "It's fine, Dad. We're just having a rough week," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the glove compartment. "Show me your arm, Chloe," I said, my voice shaking with an anger I was trying desperately to contain. She didn't move. In the driver's seat, Julian turned to look at me, his face once again perfectly composed, his eyes empty of any human emotion. "Dan, she bumped into the kitchen counter this morning," he said, using my old nickname with a casual, insulting familiarity. "You know how clumsy she can get when she's stressed." "I wasn't asking you," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my daughter. "Chloe, show me." Slowly, with a trembling hand, she pulled back the sleeve of her blue cardigan. The bruise was thick, dark purple, and shaped exactly like 4 fingers and a thumb, wrapping all the way around her delicate wrist. It wasn't from a counter. It was from a grip that had been intended to hurt, to control, to silence. My vision blurred. A wave of heat rushed up my neck, and for a second, I wanted to reach through that window, drag Julian out of that leather seat, and settle this on the concrete. But I knew my daughter. I knew that if I lost my temper, she would go into defense mode, protecting him out of fear of what he would do when I wasn't there. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. "Chloe," I said, reaching through the window and placing my hand over hers. "You remember the old pocket watch I gave you when you graduated college? The vintage silver one I spent 3 weeks rebuilding in my workshop?" She nodded, a single tear breaking free and tracking through the dust on her cheek. "The small crown on the side, the one we modified to work as an emergency transmitter for my home security system. You hold that down for 3 seconds, Chloe, just 3 seconds. It doesn't matter if it's 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. It doesn't matter if I'm in New Hampshire or Canada. You press that button, and I am coming. Do you understand me?" "We have to go, Robert," Julian said, hitting the gear shift. Chloe looked at me, her dark eyes wide and terrified, but behind the fear, there was a tiny spark of recognition, a silent agreement. "I understand, Dad," she whispered. The truck backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel, leaving me standing alone on the dark sidewalk with the wind howling through the trees. I drove back to my house in New Hampshire, but I didn't go to sleep. I sat at my workbench in the basement, surrounded by old gears, brass fittings, and the smell of lubricating oil. 3 years ago, when Julian and Chloe had first bought the house on Elm Street, they had asked me to help them update the electrical wiring and install new smoke detectors throughout the property. Julian had wanted the cheapest units available, but I had gone to a specialized security firm in Boston. I spent $400 of my own money to buy a custom carbon monoxide and smoke detector unit for the living room. It looked identical to a standard, off-the-shelf brand, but inside the plastic housing, wired directly into the house's main electrical circuit, was a high-resolution, wide-angle lens connected to a cellular transmitter. It didn't use their home internet. It didn't store data on a local hard drive that could be smashed or stolen. It uploaded a secure, encrypted video stream directly to an off-site server that I paid for monthly. I had never looked at the footage. Not once. I had told myself it was an invasion of their privacy, a paranoid old man's overreaction to a son-in-law he didn't fully trust. But as I sat at my workbench at 4 a.m, holding Chloe's torn cardigan button in my palm, I knew the time for respecting privacy was over. I opened my laptop, entered the 16-digit encryption key, and pulled up the archive for the previous 12 hours. The video loaded in high definition. The wide-angle lens captured almost the entire living room, from the front door to the entryway of the kitchen. I fast-forwarded through the afternoon until I reached the moment they came home from the Sunday dinner. The front door opened. Julian walked in, threw his keys on the counter, and turned on Chloe. His face on the screen was unrecognizable. The charming, polite businessman was completely gone, replaced by a creature of pure, venomous malice. He grabbed her by the shoulder, the same shoulder the doctor would later have to pop back into its socket, and drove her back against the wall. "You think your father is smart?" Julian hissed, his voice coming through my laptop speakers with a sickening, metallic clarity. "You think that old bastard is going to protect you? If he doesn't sign that $85,000 line of credit by the end of the week, I will make sure you lose every single thing you've ever cared about. I will burn this family to the ground, Chloe." Chloe was crying, her hands up to protect her face, her body shaking so hard the camera captured the tremor in her knees. "Please, Julian," she begged. "He's just worried about his house. He doesn't have anything else left after Mom died." "He has your future," Julian snarled, shoving her away so hard she fell against the edge of the sofa. "You tell him he signs, or you won't have a father to worry about anymore." I closed the laptop. My hands were perfectly still now, the anger having cooled into a solid, heavy block of ice in my chest. I didn't call the police then because I knew what would happen. Without a direct threat of immediate violence, Julian's lawyer would have him out on bail in 6 hours, and Chloe would be left alone in that house with a man who now knew she had betrayed him. I had to wait for her to make the call. I had to wait for the signal. That signal came at 2:12 on Tuesday morning. Now, sitting in the plastic chair of the emergency room at Mass General, I watched the digital clock on the wall transition from 3 in the morning to 4, then 5. The smell of floor wax and stale coffee was overwhelming. A detective from the local precinct, a man named Miller with tired eyes and a cheap wool coat, walked through the double doors, carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Vance?" he asked, looking at me. I stood up, my joints cracking from the hours of sitting still. "Yes. How is she?" "She's stable," Miller said, pulling out a chair and gesturing for me to sit down. The doctors popped the shoulder back in. She has some severe bruising on her throat and wrists, a minor concussion and a split lip, but she's awake. She's talking. "And Julian?" I asked, my voice flat. "He's in holding," Miller said, scratching his jaw. "He's already got his lawyer on the phone. They're claiming it was a domestic dispute, that she came at him first with a broken mug, and he was just trying to restrain her. Without clear evidence of who initiated the physical violence, it's going to be her word against his. The system is slow, Mr. Vance. If we don't have something concrete, he might be out on personal recognizance by noon." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a small black flash drive, and laid it on the clipboard in his lap. "What's this?" Miller asked, looking at the plastic drive. "That is 3 years of high-definition video from a hidden security unit inside their living room," I said. "It includes the entire altercation from tonight, the verbal threats from Sunday, and the full recording of Julian Sterling explaining exactly how he was going to blackmail my daughter into forcing me to sign that loan." Miller stared at the drive for a long moment, then looked up at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his tired face. "Well, Mr. Vance," he said, standing up, "that changes the weather completely, but the storm was only just beginning." 3 hours later, while Chloe was resting in a private recovery room, Miller called me back down to the precinct. I walked into the interview room, expecting to sign a formal statement, but instead, I found Miller sitting with a woman in a sharp navy suit. Her name was Detective Sarah Reynolds from the Financial Crimes Division. "Mr. Vance, sit down," Reynolds said, sliding a thick manila folder toward me. "We've been running a forensic audit on Julian Sterling's business account since we received your footage. We wanted to understand why a man with a supposedly successful contracting firm was so desperate for an $85,000 signature." She opened the folder, revealing columns of red ink and bank statements that looked like a long, slow suicide note. "Julian Sterling isn't just in a rough patch, Robert," Reynolds said. "He is running a massive, multi-tiered payment cycling scheme. Over the last 18 months, he has taken deposits from 14 different homeowners in the greater Boston area for high-end renovations, totaling over $400,000. He hasn't completed a single one of those jobs. He was using the new deposits to pay off the older clients who were threatening to sue, while spending the rest on high-stakes online sports betting and luxury rentals in Boston." I looked at the numbers. The total debt was $435,600. "He was drowning," I said. "He was dead in the water," Reynolds corrected. "But it gets worse. Look at page 12. I turned the page. It was a copy of a secondary mortgage application for Chloe's house on Elm Street. The application was dated 3 weeks ago for $150,000. At the bottom of the page was Chloe's signature, written in a cramped, shaky hand that didn't look like her neat teacher's script. "She didn't sign this," I said, my voice rising. "She didn't even know about it." "We know," Reynolds said. "The notary who stamped this document is Julian's younger brother, Marcus. We picked him up an hour ago. He's already singing like a canary to avoid a felony fraud charge. He admitted that Julian forged Chloe's signature and that Marcus stamped it without her ever being in the room. But Julian couldn't get the bank to release the funds because the title of the house was partially under a family trust that required your financial disclosure documents. I felt a cold drop of sweat trace down my spine. How did he get my financial disclosures? I asked. My tax returns, my trust documents, they're locked in a safe in my basement in New Hampshire. Reynolds pulled one final paper from the bottom of the folder. It was a printout of an email chain. The sender's address made my breath hitch in my throat. It was Eleanor Marsh, my ex-wife's sister, the woman who had sat at the dinner table on Sunday night, telling me that families stood together. The email contained scanned copies of my entire divorce settlement from 25 years ago, which included my social security number, my bank routing codes, and the details of the family trust. The message from Eleanor to Julian read, "Here is everything we could find on Robert's accounts. If he won't sign the bridge loan, use these to open the secondary line at the credit union. He's old. He doesn't check his balances online. By the time he realizes what happened, the Brookline project will be done and we can clear the debt." They had been planning to strip mine my entire life's savings, leave me homeless, and run Chloe's credit so far into the dirt she would never recover. I sat back in the metal chair, the fluorescent lights above me humming like a swarm of hornets. I thought about the Sunday dinner. I thought about Eleanor's expensive gold bracelets clinking together. I thought about Marcus's sports car. All of it paid for with the stolen futures of people who had trusted them. "Where is Eleanor?" I asked. "She was picked up at her home in Newton 40 minutes ago," Miller said, leaning against the doorframe. "She's currently in holding cell 3, demanding to see her lawyer. She keeps telling everyone this is a family matter that can be resolved with a meeting." "There won't be a meeting," I said. We went back to the hospital. Chloe was sitting up, her left arm strapped tightly in a black sling, her right hand holding a cup of chicken broth. The swelling on her face had gone down slightly, but the dark blue marks on her neck were still vivid, shaped like a collar of broken promises. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I had spent 3 years trying to protect her from the hard truths of her marriage, and all it had done was buy Julian more time to build his trap. When I finished speaking, she set the broth down on the bedside table. She didn't cry. The tears had been washed away by a cold, quiet determination that I had only ever seen in her mother when the doctors told us the treatment wasn't working. "He was never going to stop, was he, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, sweetheart," I said. "He wasn't. He told me that if I left him, he would make sure everyone thought I was the crazy one," she said, her eyes fixed on the hospital window. "He said he had the bank records, the police friends, the reputation. He said no one would ever believe a school teacher over a developer." I reached out and took her hand. "They believe you now, Chloe. The whole world is about to see exactly who he is." The trial of Julian Sterling began in the heat of June. The courthouse in Westchester County was an old stone monument with high ceilings and heavy oak doors that seemed designed to make you feel very small and very quiet. The air inside smelled of dust, old leather, and the sour sweat of nervous people. Julian sat at the defense table in a tailored dark blue suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands resting flat on the polished wood. Beside him was his attorney, a high-priced litigator from Boston named Vance, no relation to me, thank God, who had spent the last 6 months trying to get our video evidence suppressed on the grounds of privacy violations. The judge, a formidable woman named Patricia Owens, had rejected every single motion. Chloe and I sat in the second row of the gallery. She was wearing a simple green dress, her hair pulled back, her left shoulder moving with a slight stiffness that only I would notice. She sat straight, her eyes fixed on the back of Julian's neck. He never turned around to look at her. Not once. The prosecution's first witness was Detective Miller, who laid out the physical evidence from the night of October 14th. He showed the photographs of the broken front door, the splintered chair, and the defensive injuries on Chloe's wrists. Then came Detective Reynolds, who spent 4 hours explaining the financial house of cards Julian had built. She projected the forged secondary mortgage documents onto the screen above the jury box, followed by the email from Eleanor Marsh. The jury, 12 ordinary people from the suburbs, watched the screen with a growing intensity. A retired schoolteacher in the front row was taking notes so furiously her pen was squeaking against the paper. But the turning point of the trial came on the third day. The prosecution called Clara Harrison, the 68-year-old neighbor who lived at 1245 Elm Street. She walked to the stand with a slow, careful gait, her small leather purse clutched in both hands. She looked at Julian with an expression of such pure, quiet contempt that even his expensive lawyer looked uneasy. "Mrs. Harrison," the prosecutor said, "you have lived next door to the defendant and the victim for 3 years. Can you describe what you observed from your front porch during that time?" "I saw a young woman being systematically erased," Clara said, her voice clear and carrying to the very back of the courtroom. "In the beginning, Chloe would wave to me every morning. She had this beautiful, bright laugh. But after they married, the curtains were always drawn. When she did come out, she was always walking 2 steps behind him, her head down, her arms crossed over her chest, like she was trying to protect herself from the wind, even in July." She paused, looking directly at the jury. "And then there were the phone calls. I have a porch swing right near their fence. On summer nights, I could hear him screaming at her through the open windows. Not arguing, screaming. The kind of shouting that makes your blood go cold because you know there's no room for her to answer back. I called the non-emergency police line twice in 2024, but they told me that unless there was a noise complaint or a witness to physical violence, there wasn't much they could do." The defense lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay and speculation about the defendant's character." "Overruled," Judge Owens said, her voice sharp as a razor. "The witness is describing her direct observations." Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a small silver USB drive, holding it up for the judge to see. "I kept the footage from my porch camera," Clara said. "I didn't delete it because I knew inside my heart that a day like this would come. I have 240 separate instances of Julian Sterling dragging his wife back into that house by her arm, throwing her phone into the yard, and locking her out on the porch in the freezing cold. It's all right here." The defense table went completely silent. Julian's attorney leaned back in his chair, his hands open on his legal pad, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. He knew the game was over. The prosecution played the video from the smoke detector next. The lights in the courtroom dimmed, and the large screen filled with the green-tinted night vision footage of the living room on Elm Street. The sound of Julian's voice, the raw, animalistic snarl of a man who believed he was completely untouchable, echoed off the high stone walls of the courtroom. "You think your father is smart? You think that old bastard is going to protect you?" Chloe sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly her fingernails dug into my palm. I didn't look at the screen. I kept my eyes on the jury. I watched their faces transition from professional neutrality to profound, unmistakable disgust. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When the buzzer rang to announce they had reached a verdict, the courtroom was packed to the doors. The air was hot and still. Julian stood at the defense table, his suit jacket buttoned, his mouth set in a tight, thin line. On the charge of strangulation in the 2nd degree, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant, Julian Sterling, guilty." On the charge of aggravated assault in the 1st degree, guilty. On the charge of grand larceny and financial fraud, guilty. On the charge of criminal conspiracy, guilty. The sentence was handed down 3 weeks later. Judge Owens didn't spare him a single month of the maximum guidelines. "Julian Sterling," she said, looking down from her high bench with an expression of cold, judicial fury. "You are a predator who used the trust of a family and the love of a wife to fund a lifestyle of arrogance and greed. You believed that because you wore a suit and had a charming smile, the law would look the other way. You were wrong." She sentenced him to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole until he had served at least 9. Eleanor Marsh was sentenced to 3 years of probation and $50,000 in restitution for her role in providing the stolen financial documents. Marcus Sterling received 18 months in county jail for his fraudulent notary stamps. As the bailiffs led Julian away in handcuffs, the metallic click of the locks echoing through the quiet courtroom, he finally turned his head to look at Chloe. He looked at her with a desperate, pleading expression, as if he expected her to offer him some sign of forgiveness, some final, soft compromise. Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She met his eyes with a cold, absolute blankness that told him everything he needed to know about his place in her life. He was nothing but a broken foundation that had finally been cleared away. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright, hot July afternoon. The traffic on the street was loud, the smell of hot asphalt and summer trees filling the air. For the first time in 3 years, my daughter didn't have her head down. She was looking at the sky, her shoulders back, her chest rising and falling with a slow, easy breath that didn't have any fear left in it. "What now, Dad?" she asked, turning to me with a smile that was real, warm, and went all the way to her dark eyes. "Now," I said, wrapping my arm around her shoulders, careful of the left one, always careful. "We go home and we paint that yellow kitchen wallpaper a color your mother would have actually liked." She laughed, a bright, clear sound that bounced off the stone steps of the courthouse and carried out into the busy street. 2 months later, we sold the house in New Hampshire and the property on Elm Street. We packed up 31 years of memories into cardboard boxes, loaded them into the back of my old Ford truck, and drove west. We didn't stop until we reached the mountains of Colorado, where the sky was so wide and blue it felt like you could breathe for 100 miles in any direction. We bought a small, sunlit house with a wraparound porch and a garden that Chloe spent her afternoons filling with wild mountain flowers. I opened a small restoration shop in the town square, fixing old clocks, vintage machinery, and the things that people thought were too broken to ever be useful again. On Saturday mornings, we sit on the porch with 2 cups of hot coffee and watch the sun rise over the pine trees. The vintage silver watch is always on the table between us, its gears ticking away with a quiet, reliable rhythm that we both know will never stop. Real family isn't about the blood that runs through your veins, and it certainly isn't about the name signed on a piece of paper. Real family is the person who is already moving through the dark before you even finish pressing the button. The person who will stand behind the drywall, waiting for the cracks to show, just so they can hold the roof up for you when the storm finally hits. And as I look at my daughter sitting across from me, laughing at some small thing, I know that Martha is looking down at us from somewhere bright and warm, and that she is finally, completely at peace.